The federal court has ruled the ABC unlawfully dismissed journalist Antoinette Lattouf by cutting short her week-long radio hosting role. Lattouf was sacked after sharing a Human Rights Watch post on social media. She accused the broadcaster of unfairly dismissing her on the basis of her political opinion. The ABC rejected this argument, but in a judgment handed down on Wednesday, the court sided with Lattouf. In today's deep dive, we'll take you through the ruling and what it means for Australian media.
Hello and welcome to our YouTube audience watching us out there. Now, before we get into today's deep dive, it's a cracker. I just wanted to ask if you would do us one favor, and that is to press the subscribe button on this channel. We're trying to hit 20,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, and with one click, you can help us get there. Harry, I feel like often on this podcast, we say at the end of an episode, and when there's some news in this case, we'll make sure to bring it to you. And I want to make sure that we actually do, which is why we're talking about this judgment today. We have covered this case on the podcast in the past. Now we have a judgment. Let's start with the case itself. Tell me what actually happened here and who Antoinette Lattouf is.
So Antoinette Lattouf is a Lebanese Australian who is a broadcaster and author who founded the not-for-profit Media Diversity Australia. She was hired in December 2023 by the ABC to fill in as a presenter on their local radio program in Sydney. So during this time, Lattouf said she was told by her line manager that she was doing a good job. The audience feedback was really good. And at one point, she even talked about in the lead up to Christmas, she was getting a bit of audience feedback on their favourite Michael Bublé song. So it was very festive and not exactly like a news and current affairs type of gig.
Sure.
So the federal court was told later on that during this week-long hosting gig, Antoinette Lattouf was given some advice, and that's a really key term here, against posting on the Israel and Palestinian conflict, which at that stage was 2 months after the October 7 attacks, and Israel had started invading Gaza.
Right.
But she was told that sharing factual information from reputable sources was, quote, fine. During that week, Lattouf had shared a Human Rights Watch video with the caption, quote, "The Israeli government is using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza." This was a video that the ABC had also reported on. And the following day, Lattouf was told to leave the ABC for sharing a post that could be considered, quote, controversial, and wouldn't complete her final 2 rostered days of presenting as a fill-in host.
Okay, so just to recap, we have Antoinette Lattouf covering a week of Sydney radio for the ABC, given some advice not to post anything about a conflict that wasn't from a reputable source.
Yep.
She then posts something from Human Rights Watch. That seems to be crossing the line for the ABC, and the ABC dismiss her with 2 days left. Then this whole legal drama kicked off. How did we land up in court, though? Because a lot has to happen from a dismissal for it to actually end at a Fair Work Commission hearing.
The story quickly became a lot bigger than a presenter being dismissed from her role partway through. Lattouf argued that she was unfairly dismissed for multiple reasons. Among them were 3 areas that are identified as protections in our Fair Work laws in Australia. So that is holding a political opinion. She was dismissed because of her race and her national extractions, i.e. her identity as a Lebanese woman. She initially took this complaint to the Fair Work Commission, and that then later escalated to the federal court after some attempts to settle the matter out of court had fallen over.
Yeah, so normally the employer and the employee or the ex-employee who feels like they were unfairly dismissed will go to the Fair Work Commission for mediation and try and settle this normally financially without it proceeding to a hearing. But that didn't work. So that's when they went to the hearing, right?
That's right. So they couldn't reach a settlement. They couldn't talk it out outside of court. So it needed to escalate to the trial that we have seen play out over the last year or so. So the ABC, for its part, had contested Lattouf's claims, its central argument being that she had breached their social media policy when she shared the Human Rights Watch post, which it said had veered into a matter of controversy. It also argued that she wasn't really dismissed at all because she had been paid for the full 5 days that she had been contracted to fill in as a host. But during these legal proceedings, this is where it started to build up and gain a bit more national prominence. It was revealed that some of the senior ABC figures, which had included the former chair Ida Buttrose, had been receiving a lot of complaints from what the court described as pro-Israel lobbyists. who had been asking for Lattouf to be taken off air due to previous comments she had made about the conflict in the Middle East.
Okay, so this was a big case and it dragged on for some time. This week we got a decision. Take me through what the court ruled here.
Yeah, so Justice Daryl Rangier handed down his judgment a little earlier this week. He characterised the response of some very senior people within the ABC, which included Ida Buttrose and the former head of content, Chris Oliver Taylor, as turning from, quote, consternation into what he termed a state of panic.
Right.
And this is a quote that I'm going to read out from the judgment because I think it's quite compelling. The decision was made to appease the pro-Israel lobbyists who would inevitably escalate their complaints about the ABC, employing a presenter they perceived to have anti-Semitic and anti-Israel opinions in such a public position. So Justice Rangier also found that Lattouf was unfairly dismissed on two key grounds. The first was for expressing a public opinion when she shared the Human Rights Watch post, which he ruled amounted to holding a public opinion, which is the official language in the legislation. He didn't accept the argument that Lattouf had put forward that she was dismissed based on her race or national identity.
So there were those three arguments that you outlined right at the top, and he basically said that on the first argument, she in fact was unfairly dismissed on that, but the second and third was not.
Yep, so one of her Fair Work protections was breached in this case. He then elaborated that the ABC had breached its enterprise agreement by not giving Lattouf an opportunity to respond to claims of misconduct while she had been employed at the broadcaster.
Right, which is more of a kind of procedural point and a procedural argument.
Yeah.
And there was also this interesting argument about social media that was coming through. And I would be, it would be remiss of me as a co-founder of a social media-based news organization to not look at this really carefully and examine kind of how the court viewed reposting another NGO's or another organization's media post. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, so it was a really interesting tension that cropped up in this case. So the legal question related to whether Lattouf had breached the ABC's social media policy when she shared that Human Rights Watch post. The court ruled that she hadn't received either a direction or instruction to not post about Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza. And Justice Rangier elaborated that she was simply given advice, but told that sharing factual information from a reputable source was fine. And after this decision was delivered, Lattouf addressed the media outside the court, and this was her take on the judgment.
Today the court has found that punishing someone for sharing facts about these war crimes is also illegal. I was punished for my political opinion.
Okay, so what happens from here? What are the consequences for the ABC now?
So in the immediate term, the ABC needs to pay Antoinette Lattouf $70,000 for what's known as non-economic losses. That covers things like the psychological distress that she experienced in the aftermath of being dismissed. It also covers things like hurt reputation and a lowered perception of integrity in her work. There'll also be a separate hearing to determine what's known as a pecuniary penalty, which is just a legal way of saying a fine. And Antoinette Lattouf had initially asked for the ABC to acknowledge its wrongdoing in a public statement. So we heard a little earlier this week the ABC's new managing director, Hugh Marks, who wasn't around at the time of Lattouf's dismissal. He said in a public statement, quote, "It's clear the matter was not handled in line with our values and expectations." And further on, he gave a pretty clear signal about the issue of outside pressure influencing the broadcaster's decisions. He added, quote, "Any undue influence or pressure on ABC management or any of its employees must always be guarded against."
Right.
I might just end by mentioning the ABC, which is a taxpayer-funded organisation, spent more than $1 million on legal fees in taking this case to the federal court and defending themselves against Lattouf's claims.
It's often said that in cases like these, and this is not unique to this situation, but in fact all around the world, that the real winners in something like this tend to be lawyers and those who can bill for their time. How do we know, though, how much they spent?
So that's because of what's known as Senate estimates, and this happens a few times a year. That's this process where senators get to ask questions to government departments who are receiving money after a federal budget allocation. And because the ABC is a taxpayer-funded organisation, they also have to face up to Senate estimates, this inquiry that's very public, a few times a year if they're called upon. I think I'll just end on this note. There's been a lot of commentary around following this case with Antoinette Lattouf, but I think it was quite telling to hear from some former ABC bosses, including Alan Sunderland, who used to be the editorial chief at the ABC. He suggested that there were some serious shortcomings in this process and that the ABC, in being a publicly funded organisation, needed to consider another approach rather than going to trial.
A really interesting case, if anything, from the perspective of employment law in Australia and how that relates to social media posting, which I know has become more of a topic of conversation in workplaces across the country, not just in newsrooms. But that brings to the end this year-long saga in the Fair Work Commission and Federal Court. Harry, thank you for joining us today on the pod.
Anytime, Sam.
And that's all we've got for you this Friday morning on the Daily Aus. We're going to be back in your ears this afternoon with the headlines. Until then, have a fantastic day and we'll chat to you later.